Hi, everyone. Welcome to your podcast, New Books in Economic and Business History. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure to be with Yuhua Wang. He's professor of government at Harvard University, and he's the author of The Rise and Fall of Imperial China, The Social Origin of State Development. This is a super interesting book. We're going to be talking about that and about Yuhua's career. Let me say hi to him first. Hi, Yuhua. How are you?
Hi, Javier. Good to see you again.
I'm very glad to have you here. We were chatting just a bit before about how your research agenda and mine are very similar in many ways. We both share this interest for social networks and for elites. I'm going to ask you a bit more about that later. But before that, why don't you tell us a bit about your background? Tell us a bit about your life, your career. Where are you from? Where did you study? How did you ended up being interested in Chinese politics, Chinese history? Tell us a bit about that, please.
Yeah, thanks. I was born and raised in China, in Beijing, and I did my undergrad and also master's at Peking University, where I majored in political science. And then I decided to go abroad to study in the US. I got into the PhD program at the University of Michigan. I studied there for 5 years, and then my first job was at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked there for 4 years, and then I moved to Harvard. I've been at Harvard since then. Uh, well, I guess the one moment I always remember, which might play the role in provoking my interest in politics, was 1989 in Tiananmen Square. I was in Beijing at the time, and I remember I was in school one day, I think in late May, and then the teachers came in suddenly to say, school is canceled today, you all go home. So I was 8 years old, and then I didn't know what's going on, right? This is, I know that this is half day, like 11 a.m., something like that. And then I was very happy. I thought, there's no school, I could go home to play. And I was just walking home from school. It's a 10 minutes walk. And then along the way, I saw tanks on the street. And then the tanks, every tank, there's a soldier. And then the soldier would hold a gun and then point the gun at the pedestrians on the street. And then I just saw those tanks roaming by. And then very close to me, like 10 meters. And then in every tank there's a soldier holding the gun. And then I just saw this one. I just remember this image very vividly because it's had a very deep mark in my memory. This one soldier holding the gun, and then holding the gun toward at me. And then I was very scared at the time because I don't know what would happen if he pulled the trigger. And I always think about this moment. And then what if he pulled the trigger, right? And then he could pull the trigger because at the time they got the order from the Communist Party that they could pull the trigger if they wanted to. And then but this question was always in my mind, for many years. And then that's probably the most important reason I got into politics. I just try to understand um, what happened on that day, and then how to understand, given what happened in Beijing, how to understand how politics can affect people's lives. I was a child at the time, and then this has this deep mark in my memory, and then I just try to know more about how politics works.
That's a fascinating story, actually. There's so many things that have been said about that episode, but it's probably the first time that I like hear about like a personal experience in that regard. And I'm curious about how was the transition from the Chinese education system to the American one, right? Like, I'm not very familiar with how education works in China, but I imagine that the type of politics that you study in college is probably different from the one that you would study in the US. And well, not just that, I'm sure that the codes and the practices are different. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I got into Peking University for my undergrad. And then the way it works in China is when you are in high school, you need to say what majors you want to concentrate in while in college. And then, we were all teenagers. We have no idea what we want to study, right? And then we had to decide very early on, like in high school. And then my first choice was history. And then because I was really into history books in high school, so I wanted to study history in college. But I didn't get in. I my national entrance exam score was not high enough to get into history. But luckily, political science is not a very popular major in China, so I was very lucky to get into political science. But the result was I hated political science in my first 3 years. Partly because I was not into political science, but also because the way the professors taught political science in China. I think there's a mix. I would say that a lot of the courses are ideological, right? We
I was
took
gonna ask you
courses.
that. Is it like Marxism or like what?
Yeah,
What
that's one of the
exactly?
required courses. We spent the whole, I think, the freshman year taking this course called Marxism, and then basically learning about what Marx said, what Engels said, what are some of the followers said, and then it's not very empirical. It's not like let's test this hypothesis, right? Using the French Revolution. So it's more like in the original text, Marx said this, and then Engels said this, and then Lenin said this, right? And then it was boring at the time, for a 18-year-old. And then uh, that was a majority of the courses I took. We also took courses on Leninism, on Maoism, on Deng Xiaoping's thoughts, all those ideological courses. But then there was also, what provoked my interest, I guess, was gradually we also started to take some courses that are more empirical, I would say, starting in my third year. I remember I took a course with Professor Shen Mingming, who taught a course on compared politics, and then the way he taught political science was very different. And then I think he was the person who led me into political science because he is a survey researcher. So he also runs a survey center at Peking University. So he involved the students in his class into his survey projects, and I was able to join the project and then go to different places in China. I was born in Beijing and also spent most of my time in the city. I didn't get to see the whole country, but by being involved in his survey projects, I was able to travel to different places, to rural China, for example, remote villages. That's in 2002, 2003. And then I went to small villages in Henan, in Jiangsu, and then I was able to just knock on people's doors and then talk to people, right, and then see what their real lives look like, right, and then the survey was about their experiences with the legal institutions in China. So they were able to tell me a lot of stories about they had a dispute with their neighbors, and then they were not able to solve it in the village, and then they go to the government. There's a lot of corruption in the government. They cannot solve it. Then they have to go to the court. Then in many cases they still couldn't solve their problems, right? So this is all kind of frustrations, and then just by talking to those villagers really opened my eye, I think, and then made me think deeply about how politics can really affect people's lives. That's going back to the question I asked myself, when I was 8 years old, seeing those tanks. And then that really was the reason, I think, why I was determined to study politics.
And I mean, now I'm thinking like when you describe the differences between these two systems, how much of foreign knowledge is taught or is even like spill over like Chinese students. So, for instance, your book, how many people are going to read your book in China? Is it going to be potentially used in a regular syllabus of political science in a Chinese university? What's the relationship of Chinese academia with foreign studies on China?
Yeah, I still don't know whether my book will be included on the syllabus. My first book I know was not allowed to be purchased by the libraries, and also not allowed to teach in classes. My first book on tying the autocrats' hands, which is on China's legal reforms. And then it's probably because of the title. I have the word autocrat, and that's why it's banned in China. So I know that that book is a no. And then for the second book, I'm hopeful because this is about history, and then compared with contemporary politics history, which happened, before 1911, in Imperial China, is supposed to be less sensitive. But I guess people can always draw some parallel, right, between history and the present, and then say, how uh, this book on emperors, for example, can tell us something about today's China. And so I worry that if they see the parallel, and then they might not allow the book to be taught.
Right, right. I understand. So it seems that, yeah, like the censorship is related to current matters, right?
Yes, yes.
Um,
Right. One thing, for example, we can talk more about this later. One thing I talk about in the book is how long the emperors could stay in power, and then how they died, right? And then I show that a lot of emperors actually died of assassinations from the elites, and then only half of the emperors in Chinese history in the last 2,000 years, only half of the emperors were able to die naturally, because of age or health reasons. So that's a pretty important wake up call, I guess, for the Chinese leaders today, right? If they know, for example, all their predecessors, half of them were assassinated by the elites. That's quite important. Uh,
right, right. Probably you don't want like people to be thinking about that idea of you perishing in a non-natural way.
exactly.
But yeah, we're gonna talk about that, and let's start talking about that. And probably the first question I have for you is to elucidate what seems your um, core argument, which at the same time seems to be inspiring what you describe as a regularity, right? Which is that there seems to be this tension in Chinese history between state strength or state capacity and the duration of rulers in power, right? Can you say a bit about that and how you articulate that in the book?
Sure. So the puzzle that I was trying to address in this book was that I using a lot of data on Chinese emperors, but also on how much taxation they could collect in different dynasties. I discovered that there's this tension between ruler duration and state capacity. That is, over the last 2,000 years, um, in dynasties where you see the rulers who are able to stay in power for a very long time. For example, in the latter half of imperial China, from the 11th century to the 19th century, Chinese emperors were increasingly secure. They were able to stay in power for a very, very long time. In the Qing dynasty, for example, in the 18th century, 19th century, many of the emperors were able to stay in power for 30, 40, or even 60 years. So that's a very long time. But at the same time, it is also in those times we also see a declining state capacity of imperial China. That is, in terms of how much taxation they can collect from the society, whether they can mobilize the population for war. Those measures of state capacity, we often see a very low level during the times when the rulers were able to stay in power for very, very long. So therefore, you see this. It's like a seesaw, right? It's like the ruler is sitting on one end, but also the state is sitting on the other end, and then they go up and down. But then you never see a scenario where you can have a long ruling ruler, but at the same time, they're very strong state. When you have a strong state, you always have a short-lived ruler. When you have a long-lived ruler, you always have a weak state. So the two things don't go together, and then that's the puzzle I try to solve in this book. And then the conclusion I arrived was that I argue that the Chinese rulers faced a trade-off that I call the sovereign's dilemma. That is, if you want to have a strong state, you need to have a very coherent elite where, say, for example, your politicians can trust each other, they can take collective actions to make policies to strengthen the state. For example, to make fiscal policies or military reforms to strengthen the government, right? But then the problem is when you have a coherent elite, they can also take collective action against the ruler. Therefore, when you have a coherent elite, you have a very strong state, but then very short-lived rulers because the rulers will be threatened by the coherent elite, right? And then the other uh, the solution for the ruler to this problem is they can weaken the elites, right? For example, they can break their networks. They can use some strategies to weaken the elites, and then to lengthen their duration in power. They can stay in power for a very, very long time, but the result of this is the elite will become very incoherent and also fragmented, so that they cannot take collective action to strengthen the state, right? So the whole book can come down to this dilemma, and then how the Chinese emperors solve this dilemma in different dynasties. And then the basic story is the first half of the imperial China. From um, that started in the Tang Dynasty, which started in the 7th century. So I say, from the 7th century to about 10th century, that's a scenario where you have a very coherent elite, and then as a result, state capacity was very strong because the elites were able to take collective action to reform the fiscal system, the military system, to make China stronger. But at the same time, the rulers in that time were also more likely to be assassinated by the elites. And then in the second half of imperial China, from the 11th century to the 20th century, you have a scenario where you have a very fragmented elite, and then they're not able to take collective action to strengthen the country, and then the country's state capacity gradually declined, but at the same time, ruler duration lengthened. That's a result of this.
So you have very specific ways to think about the cohesiveness of this elite and their collective behavior. But before asking you about that, I want you to tell us a bit more about who these elite were. Like, what were they doing? Like, were they landowners? I imagine, right? Or what was the source of their power, and what was their type of interaction? I know this varies across periods, but between them and the monarchs, which were the emperors, basically. Tell us a bit about how we should think about this elite. Who are they?
Sure, they were mostly economic elites in the first place, right? They were all big landowners, as you hinted. Uh, they were a little bit different in these two periods. So the first period that I look at, for example, from the Tang Dynasty um, on to the um, early Song Dynasty, there was an aristocratic class in China, which very very similar to the European nobility. There was a class of about 200 families who were nobility from very early on. From the third century, first century, they have the pedigree. From a long time ago, they have been government officials. For generations, and then they also were geographically congregated. They all live in the capitals. There were two capital cities in the Tang Dynasty, and then most of the aristocratic families, have their male members living in the capital cities because they all work in the capital. They all worked in the national government, so they want to, be close to the political center of the empire. And then another feature of the aristocratic families was that they all intermarried intensively. That is, their children all intermarried with each other, and also very um, exclusively. That is, they only marry other aristocratic families. They don't marry, ordinary families or the non-noble families. And then that made them a very coherent group, because of um, the, the geographic congregation, but also the very intense intermarriages. They were able to form a network where everybody was connected with everybody else, right? So all the 200 families were embedded in this very close knit network. That's what uh, the elite looked like for the first half of imperial China, and then that class um, was physically destroyed by a mass rebellion in the late ninth century. There was this um, mass rebellion, mass rebellion, sorry, mass rebellion led by the salt merchant Huang Chao in late ninth century. So they started somewhere else, but they went to the capital cities. And then when they occupied the capital cities for 2 years, they were able to kill all the aristocratic families. So that's the end of nobility in China. And then, so in the second half of Imperial China, most of the politicians, the bureaucrats, were drawn from local land-owning elite families. So they were now those central elites. They were all based in local China. They were landowners, and then because of the deaths of the aristocratic families, the emperors, starting in the 11th century, they started to use the civil service examination system to choose bureaucrats. And then it means that, starting from the 11th century on, the sons and grandsons of those local landowning elites started to learn and also prepare for the civil service examination system, and then take the exam, and if they succeeded, they can become politicians to work in the government. So later on, for the second half of imperial China, most of the politicians in the central government were drawn from the local landowning elites.
And I mean, when you described that this, like the origin of the specific people and the connections between them, you know that because you have this extraordinary source of information that partly comes from visiting cemeteries, right? Why don't you tell us a bit about that, right? That's a fascinating story, and it's interesting because part of my work does something similar in a very different context. I work in Latin America mostly, but I've done that in a similar fashion, visiting cemeteries, taking notes of things around. So I also have some slides on that when I present on my papers, and that's one of the reasons why I love your work the first time that I saw you presenting. But why don't you tell us a bit about the data collection process, right? Like how did you end up knowing who these elite were, how they were connected, um, how that happens from an empirical point of view?
Yeah, that's you know an accident in terms of how I discovered the data source. About 15 years ago, I was still a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and I was working on my dissertation, which was on contemporary China. But I took a trip in a summer to the city of Xi'an in China, and then Xi'an is a very old capital of several dynasties of Chinese history. And then I just went there for a tour, and then one day I was led by a local friend to downtown Xi'an, and then there's a museum in downtown Xi'an, and then we went in, and then I discovered that the museum is about tombstones. So they in imperial China, when some famous people die, right, and then their family would spend money and also ask the friends to write a very lengthy eulogy, and then they will buy this tombstone, and and then they would carve the lengthy eulogy on a piece of tombstone, usually a limestone, and then those stones, very good quality, and then they survive, hundreds of years, sometimes more than 1,000 years. And then this museum has amazing collection of the tombstones. Some of them are from more than 1,000 years ago, from the Tang Dynasty, but most of them are from the Song Dynasty, for example, or the Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, hundreds of years ago. And then I was walking in this museum, and then just and I saw those tombstones, and I stopped by one of them. I just started reading, and then there are two sides of the tombstone. On the front side, it has the position, the honor, the name of the deceased person, right? And then on the back side, which is more interesting, is this lengthy eulogy that the friend of this deceased person wrote, and then they carved it on the tombstone. And then I started reading. I realized that, as a social scientist, I'm my eyes sparkled, because I realized that's data, right? That's what we call data. That is, the lengthy eulogy will include the hometown of the place, how he grew up, usually a man. So how he grew up, his parents, and then he took the civil service examination system, in which year, his rank, and then his positions in the government, and then his whole achievement, right? Like the whole vita is carved on the tombstone. And then what's more interesting about the tombstone is, at the end of the tombstone, they would talk about his own family, for example, his wife, his daughters and his sons, and then his sons-in-law, daughters-in-law, and then also from which family he married his wife from, right? His father-in-law, mother-in-law, so on and so forth. And then at the time, I was quite amazed by the amount of information on the tombstone, but I didn't care too much because I was working on my dissertation on legal institutions in China, so I didn't saw that I could use data. But that image was always in my head, that I know that there's this thing, tombstone, that existed in China. And then starting about, I think, 8 or 7 years ago, when I started working on the second book, I started reading historians' work, and they talk about how the elites was transformed in imperial China. Their social relations became localized, their networks became more fragmented. But then all those historians' work are based on case studies. They went to one county, they look at the genealogies of some local families, then they come to the conclusion, right? And then I realized I want to do this more systematically, right? And to write a book of this scale, uh, I want data that can show me, long-term changes, right? And then also very systematic data on a large number of politicians in different dynasties. And then that image from 15 years ago suddenly came to my mind, that I realized, oh, actually, I visited this temple where they kept all the tombstones, right? And then maybe I was not quite sure. I was not very confident, but maybe if I could collect all the tombstones that are out there, right, I should be able to construct a very systematic data set of where the elites were, their hometowns, their parents, so on and so forth, but also very importantly, their kinship networks, right? I can know exactly their wife's family, their daughter-in-law's family, son-in-law's family, right? And then that's how this started. That I realized that I can use this archaeological source for political science research.
Let me ask you a couple of things regarding that process of data collection, like very particular, but for someone who does something similar, I'm curious about them. So, one, like, how did you end up like gathering the data? Were you able, like, I guess you had a team of people that were like taking pictures and transcribing. Um, so tell me a bit about the process of like in picking which temples. I guess that you didn't visit just that temple, probably several others. How do you pick where to look at? And then how did you think about the I guess the representativeness of the data, right? There's some people that made their terms in certain way. There's a reason why some are preserved and others not. How did you approach that issue of the data?
Yeah, those are great questions. So very luckily, when I started collecting data, I realized that a lot of the tombstones have been digitized. And then, um, say for example, the Song Dynasty, which became a chapter in my book, most of the tombstones from the Song Dynasty, because they were, the eulogies were written by very famous literary people, by writers, for example, poets, and then uh, all those writings were preserved. And then digitized and also included in some volumes on song writings. For example, there's this volumes of books that called the complete prose of song, which includes basically all the writings that we can collect from the Song Dynasty. And then those writings include the eulogies they wrote for their friends. And then um, it means that I don't for a lot of the tombstones, actually for most of them, I don't have to go to the temple and then take pictures and then transcribe them. Actually, most of them are digitized. At the same time, at Harvard, there's also a project called the CBDB, the China Biographic Database, that Peter Bow, a historian, have been compiling for years. And then in the CBDB database, um, they also have collected a lot of the genealogies, the local gazetteers, but also the tombstones. So I was able to extract a lot of data from the CBDB database as well. So this is combining, I think, combining the different sources from the original writing from the tombstone, but also from the existing database. I was able to construct this database of the elites kinship networks. But the problem, as you have realized, is that there's a huge missingness right in the data. The missingness is the following: that is, the Chinese imperial governments were very good at documenting names. That is, from the official records from each dynasty, I was able to identify who were the major politicians in each dynasty, and then they did a very good job. So every dynasty would document all the major officials from the previous dynasty. So using those records, I was able to get a list of all the major politicians in each dynasty, and then using that list of names, I was able to collect their kins, their family information, their kinship networks, so on and so forth. And then for my database, I realized that I can only collect half of them. So only half of the names on the official list had information on kinship networks. And then even the people who have some information on their kinship networks, I'm sure that there are a lot of people missing from the kinship network. For example, their aunt, or for example, their third son, and then the wife of their third son might not be as documented as the wife of their eldest son, right? And then so there are a lot of missingness in terms of who has the data on kinship network. But also within the network, there are a lot of missingness, right? The way I deal with this is I want to be very transparent, right? As I said this in the book, that this is a book on history, so therefore we should know that there are a lot of missing data problems or inaccuracies of data. So I want to be very transparent, but also at the same time, there are ways that social scientists have designed to deal with the missing data problem. For example, multiple imputation, and then using the information we know, we can try to predict, how many kin they have, how many sons they have, and then in my book I try different methods, and then I try to show that using those different methods we can come to the same conclusion. But I think most importantly, uh, my message in the book is, look, we know that we cannot get 100% of the data from 1,000 years ago, but here are the people that are probably the most important, right? Because we know that the more important they are, the more likely
They are to
their
be.
tombstones will be preserved, and then their family information will be documented, right? And then so I say that this is definitely not a random sample, but this is probably a very indicative sample, right? This is a sample that is really important in that dynasty. So we know, the most important people from that dynasty, probably not a representative sample, but the most important people from those dynasties.
Right, right. I mean, I love the way you frame it because I think that's an inevitable challenge of dealing with social networks, right? Like in theory, we're all connected, the world is fairly small and we're not ever going to be able to fully reconstruct an empirical network because of that. And and that's a problem, but like the option of a purist in this regard would be then to do nothing and just like not use that great source of information and just explore it tentatively. So I really love the like the pragmatic approach that you have to that data. But so just to connect a bit your like the description of the data with your big claims, why don't you tell us a bit about this ideal networks that you have in your head, this star type of network and the bow tie that sort of match your description of a more fragmented elite in one period and more cohesive in other period.
Yeah, exactly. So I argue that we can use a very simple theory to explain the changes in Chinese politics, over the last 2,000 years, right? And then the idea is that I argue there are probably two stereotypes, or two ideal types of elite social structures, right? And then the first type is what I call a star network, and then in the star network, um, you have central elites, the people who work in the central government. They are connected with each other, right, through some social ties. And then in this book, I focus on intermarriages, right? So it means that, for example, in this star network, all the central government officials are connected indirectly or directly through intermarriages. Their sons and daughters were married with each other, right? And then um, that will make the central elites very coherent. But at the same time, it's called the star network also because the center was connected with the periphery through social ties. And then um, by center, I mean the central politicians, and then by periphery, I mean the local families. For example, through those intermarriages ties, the central elites were able to marry from the local families, right? For example, their sons and daughters, and then were married. So, for example, the prime minister's son might marry a daughter, the daughter from a family that located in the west of China, right? And then where the second son was married to a daughter from a family in the north, right? And then so through those intermarriages, the central elites were able to connect with families that are located in different places in China, right? So it looks like um, a star network, right? You have the center, and then also the center was connected with the periphery. And then the nice thing about this Star Network is the Star Network is a great news for the state because once the elites are connected with each other, but also they're connected with the periphery, they have a strong interest in strengthening the central state because their family interests are scattered everywhere in the country, right? You have, your daughter-in-law from the north, you have, your son-in-law from the west. Therefore, you prefer to say, let's all pay taxes to the central state and then make the central state stronger so that the central state can, can provide protection for all of us because we're everywhere, right? It's much cheaper for us to just pay taxes to the central government and then to seek this national coverage, right? And also because of the connections within the center, they were also able to make a credible commitment to each other to say, I will um, make my effort to strengthen the central government. You need to do your part too, right? And then they were able to take collective action to support central reforms, for example, fiscal reforms or military reforms to strengthen the central government, right? So the Star Network is great for state capacity, but it's really bad news for the ruler because once the elites are connected in this very close knit way, they were also able to um, organize a rebellion, for example, right? A coup against the ruler when they wanted to, and then so the trade-off of the Star Network is it's great for state capacity but really bad for the ruler. Then the second ideal type of elite social structure is what I called a bow tie network. And then imagine the bow tie, right? You have the two triangles, basically, and then it means that the central elites are not connected with each other, right? They are not connected by social ties. Their daughters and sons are not married with each other. And then at the same time, when they choose which local families to marry into, they will only focus on families in one region, right? The two triangles is, for example, in one case, the central elite will only marry the people from the west, and then in the other case, they will only marry the people from the east, right? And then in the bow tie network, it means that the central elites cannot coordinate because they don't trust each other, right? They are not embedded in the same social network. They don't share the information. So therefore, they would have a hard time organizing any coups against the ruler, right? So the Bowtie network is actually great news for the ruler, but it's really bad news for the state because the elites, they are all locally embedded. Their family interests are locally focused, right? So they care about, for example, the West, or they care about the East. They don't care about the whole country. And then their best scenario is to say, I want to keep my resources at the local level. I want to strengthen my local family interest, right? I want to keep all the money at the local level in my own family. And then I don't want to pay taxes to the central state because the central state might use my money to support the other family, right, in the East. I don't want to do that, right? So in the bowtie network is great news for the ruler because they cannot coordinate, but it's bad news for state capacity because they are all locally concentrated. At the same time, the central elites are so incoherent that they cannot take any collective actions against the ruler. And then so I use these two graphs. It's a very simple story. So I use these two graphs to characterize how Chinese politics changed from the Tang Dynasty, for example, to the Song Dynasty, because there was a period when the Tang Dynasty has argued that from the 7th century to the 9th century was characterized as a star network. You have the aristocratic families who are married with each other, also concentrated in the capital areas. So it looks like a star network. So we should expect to see very short ruler duration, right? There were a lot of assassinations, but at the same time, the Tang elites were able to make policies to strengthen the Tang government. And then the mass rebellion in the 9th century destroyed the star network, then paved the way for the transition to a bow tie network. And then the bow tie network can characterize the uh, Chinese dynasties from the 10th century to the early 20th century, right? And then, but the problem of a bow tie network is also you have longer ruler durations, but then the state capacity gradually declines.
Lower. Um, I want to know in this story. So this is a story about elites, and I'm curious about what's the role of the people here, right? So we're talking about the most populous um, nation or entity, and over history, it's still. And you already mentioned like one specific way in which they seem to have been important with the specific rebellion that basically eliminated every person of the aristocracy. But was like what is the underlying role of all that people that were not of the elite, right? I guess some of them were peasant traders. How frequent were these popular revolts? I have the impression, based on my very limited knowledge of Chinese history, that they were rather frequent. How was the interaction of these people with this elite? Tell me a bit about that. How do you like think about that in your story?
Yeah, the masses played a very important role, like peasants or artisans, workers, so on and so forth. And then in my book, I specifically talk about the role of mass rebellions in Chinese history, and then I argue that they played a very important role in uh, changing the equilibrium, right? You have the star network, which represented one type of equilibrium, right? You have this state strengthening, but also uh, shorter duration of the rulers, and then to change the equilibrium, you need the masses, and then but the masses, they cannot organize themselves. You still need the elites to organize the masses. In all the instances that I talk about, for example, the Huangchao rebellion in the 9th century, the Taiping rebellion um, in the 19th century, which played a very important role in changing the dynamic of those elite networks. Um, uh, the story cannot be told without talking about the role played by the elites. The masses were the participants, but then what really changed the politics were through the elites, right? Um, for example, the Huangchao rebellion in the 9th century that I mentioned destroyed the old network. But then for a new network to emerge, you need the ruler to come up with a set of new institutions, for example, the civil service examination system, but also you need a new type of elites, the so-called gentry families, the local landowners. They have to, send their sons to compete in the exams, and then their sons and grandsons, they become the new bureaucrats, right? So the masses, they, because of the inequality in education opportunities, they were not able to take advantage of the civil service examination system. It's actually those local landlords, right, who were able to fill the power vacuum left by the old nobility, right? And then in the 19th century, for example, the key story there was the Taiping Rebellion. There was, probably the largest civil war in human history. It was this um, rebellion led by Hong Xiuquan in mid 19th century, and then the participants were mostly peasants, workers, so on and so forth. But I think the key uh, 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 um, process in the Taiping Rebellion was because of the rebellion, because of the weak state capacity of the Qing dynasty, the local landowning elites were able to take advantage of the opportunity to form their own private security. That is, private militia, for example, were formed during the Taiping Rebellion, and then that's really the key to the fall of the Qing dynasty. That is because the Qing state lost the monopoly over violence, right? And then the local landowning elites were able to take advantage of the Taiping Rebellion to have their private army, and those private armies became more independent in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then contributed to the fall of the Qing dynasty. So I think the masses played a very important role, but I think when we look at the whole causal chain, I guess is a lot of time it started with the masses, a rebellion, but then the elites had to respond, and then their responses or their reactions were really, really important in determining whether the dynasty will fall or survive. Right?
I mean, we're running out of time, but I don't want to leave without asking you a bit about the present, because although this history book, you do attempt to connect a bit some of your story with more contemporaneous events in the book itself at the end, right? So I mean, I don't want you to get into details that you don't think are appropriate, but how do you think that, or what do you think that we can learn from your story to understand modern Chinese politics, which this was a very eventful weekend, and well, I don't want to say much, you're the expert. How do you think that, based on your book and your research, we can understand better what is happening in China in the last couple of years or so?
That's a terrific question, Javier. I think what the takeaway from my book is that based on 2,000 years of Chinese history, there seemed to be a tension between the fate of the individual ruler and then the fate of their dynasties, right? Or the country they're governing, right? From Chinese history, we know, I show that when the rulers want to stay in power for a very, very long time, their strategy is to weaken the elites, right? They don't want the elites to be too strong, because when the elites are too strong, they become threatening, right? And then the strategies used by the Chinese emperors, for example, starting in the Song dynasty, in the Ming dynasty, in the Qing dynasty, was that they use various tactics to break the networks among the elites, to make them unconnected. At the same time, they also use various institutions to weaken the elites, right? They don't want the elites to be connected. They don't want the elites to take collective action. And then that will serve the personal interests of the rulers, but then at the expense of the capacity of the state. That is, once the elites are weakened, they no longer can do something to make policies or to take some action to strengthen the government. And then that's how Imperial China fell, right? So we can draw a lesson from Imperial China is that when you have rulers who refuse to leave, the elites will be weakened, and then the country will fall, right? And then uh, there's a lot of differences between imperial China and contemporary China, right? We are talking about a modern polity with a modern political party, the Communist Party, right, in power today, and then they have various institutions, for example, the party institution, the legislature, some form of elections to regulate elite behavior. Um, Therefore, we cannot really draw this direct parallel from imperial China to today's China. But I think there are some lessons we can still learn. That is, we probably will see some similar strategies by the current ruler of China, right? Xi Jinping, as we just saw in the past week during the party's 20th Party Congress, that if he wants to strengthen his own power, a very important thing he needs to do is to weaken the elites, right? He cannot rely on a well-connected elites. He have to break the networks among the elites. For example, a lot of um, the corruption investigations that he has carried out in the last 10 years, with the goal of breaking the factional ties. Right, he doesn't want to see other politicians or other bureaucrats in China so well connected, because that's threatening to his rule, right? Using the anti-corruption campaign, he has been able to weaken those connections and then break those networks in different localities in China. But also at the same time, if he wants to stay in power for a very long time, he need to surround himself with people who are loyal to him but not necessarily competent, right? And then because very competent people can be threatening to his rule. So therefore, you can imagine that as a consequence of surrounding the ruler with loyalty uh, rather than competence, you can imagine there might be some consequences for policies, right? And then compared with with the government, staffed with very competent politicians, you might imagine, for example, the policies that are coming out from the government in the next 10 years will be uh, less well designed, less well thought of, and then that has consequences for for the whole country, for the economy. We are already seeing the Chinese economy slow down, right, in the last 2 or 3 years, partly because of the pandemic, but I think also because the politics has changed in China, and then with a ruler who want to concentrate all the power in himself, that will have very bad consequences for the country.
Well, that's fascinating. I really love the narrative arc that we took here, going from ancient China to contemporary events. I really like in reading your book. I recommend it to everyone. I love the cover, by the way. Um, and this was a lovely conversation. I hope to talk to you soon, and to all the listeners. I hope that you stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Javier.